The darkest weapons in history were never designed for war. They were designed for something far more personal: punishment. Across centuries, rulers, soldiers, and authorities developed horrifying devices intended to break the human body, and sometimes the human mind. Some were created to force confessions. Others were meant to punish prisoners in front of crowds. And some became so infamous that their names still survive centuries later. But here's what makes these weapons even more disturbing. Not everything you've heard about them is true. Some of history's most famous torture devices are surrounded by myths, exaggerated stories, and legends that appeared long after the events themselves. So tonight, we're separating history from horror and uncovering the deadliest torture weapons that humanity actually used, or believed it used, because the darkest part of history isn't always what we imagine. It's what people were willing to do in the name of power. Why did people create torture devices? For most of human history, punishment wasn't simply about justice. It was about power. In ancient kingdoms, empires, and later medieval societies, rulers had limited ways to control people. There were no modern prisons, no forensic investigations, and no sophisticated interrogation techniques. Fear became one of their most powerful tools. A prisoner could be tortured to obtain information, force a confession, punish an alleged crime, or simply serve as a warning to everyone watching, and that last purpose was crucial. Punishment was often made public. The message was simple: obey the authorities, or this could happen to you. Over time, punishments became increasingly elaborate. Chains, restraints, racks, cages, and other mechanisms were designed to control the victim, while allowing the person carrying out the punishment to remain in complete control. But there's something important to remember. Many stories about historical torture have been exaggerated over the centuries. Some devices shown in museums or popular documentaries were probably never used in the way modern stories claim. Others may have existed, but their real purpose was very different. And that is what makes this history so fascinating. Because behind every terrifying object is a question. Was this really used to torture people? Or did the legend become more horrifying than the truth? To answer that, we have to go back to... And the first device was built around a deceptively simple idea: stretching the human body beyond its limits. Known as the rack, this device became one of the most infamous symbols of torture in European history. At first glance, it looked almost disappointingly simple. A long wooden frame, a series of ropes, and rotating mechanisms at either end. But its simplicity was exactly what made it so terrifying. The prisoner would be restrained on the wooden frame, with ropes secured around the body. As the mechanism was turned, the ropes would gradually become tighter. The purpose was not simply to cause pain. The rack was designed to create fear and helplessness. The prisoner could see the mechanism moving. They could hear the wood and rope tightening. And they knew that every turn was bringing them closer to the limit of what their body could endure. In some historical accounts, the rack was used during interrogations to obtain information or confessions. But there was another psychological weapon involved: uncertainty. After the rack came a device that would become one of the most terrifying images in the history of torture: a tall, human-shaped iron coffin lined with spikes. It became known as the Iron Maiden. According to the popular story, a victim would be forced inside the metal chamber. Once the doors closed, the spikes would supposedly pierce the body, causing a slow and agonizing death. For centuries, the Iron Maiden has been presented as the perfect symbol of medieval cruelty. But there is a problem. There is surprisingly little evidence that medieval torturers actually used it. In fact, the famous Iron Maiden associated with torture appears to have emerged much later than the Middle Ages. Many historians believe that the objects now called Iron Maidens were constructed or assembled in the 18th or 19th centuries, long after the medieval period had ended. So how did one of the most famous torture devices in history become so closely associated with the Middle Ages? Part of the answer lies in the power of storytelling. As old objects were displayed in museums and collections, dramatic stories were sometimes attached to them. A strange iron cabinet with spikes was far more memorable when presented as a medieval instrument of torture than as a later historical curiosity. And once the story became popular, it was repeated in books, in exhibitions, and eventually in movies and television. Over time, the legend became more famous than the evidence. The Brazen Bull, a punishment designed to terrify. The Iron Maiden may have been more legend than reality, but centuries before that legend was ever born, another terrifying story was already circulating through the ancient world. A story about a machine built in the shape of a bull. It was called the Brazen Bull. According to ancient accounts, the device was created in 6th century BCE Sicily by a craftsman named Perillos of Athens for the tyrant Phalaris of Acragas, and the design was as disturbing as the story behind it. The bull was supposedly made entirely from bronze. Inside was a hollow chamber, large enough for a person. The victim, according to the accounts, would be placed inside the bull before a fire was lit beneath it. As the bronze heated, the chamber would become unbearably hot. But the most horrifying part of the story wasn't simply the heat. The bull was reportedly designed with a system of tubes that transformed the victim's screams into sounds resembling the roar of an actual bull. In other words, the machine was supposedly designed to turn suffering into a spectacle. The story becomes even darker from here. According to legend, Perillos himself demonstrated his invention to Phalaris. But instead of rewarding the craftsman, Phalaris allegedly ordered Perillos to enter the bull himself. The device was heated, and the man who had designed it became its first supposed victim. Whether every detail of this story is true remains uncertain. Ancient writers recorded different versions of the tale, and historians have long questioned how much of the story is historical fact and how much was shaped by later storytelling. But regardless of its exact history, the Brazen Bull became a powerful symbol because it represented something more than physical punishment. It represented the transformation of suffering into entertainment and spectacle, and that idea appears repeatedly throughout the history of torture. The goal wasn't always simply to hurt someone. Sometimes, the punishment was designed to make everyone else watching feel afraid. A ruler didn't need to punish an entire population. He only needed to convince them that he was capable of doing something terrible, and few stories captured that idea more vividly than the Bronze Bull. But the ancient world wasn't finished inventing terrifying punishments, because eventually, the focus shifted from fire and spectacle to something much more personal, the human body itself. The Brazen Bull was designed to turn suffering into spectacle. But the next device was built around something much quieter: helplessness. It is known today as the Judas Cradle, the breaking wheel when punishment became a public spectacle. The Judas Cradle was built around helplessness, but the next punishment was designed to make suffering visible. It was known as the breaking wheel, and for centuries it became one of the most feared punishments in parts of Europe. The basic idea was brutally simple. A large wooden wheel became the center of the punishment. According to historical accounts, condemned prisoners could be restrained against the wheel, while executioners used heavy weapons as part of the punishment. The goal was not simply to kill. The punishment could be deliberately prolonged, and that was precisely what made it so terrifying. But there was another element that made the breaking wheel different from many other methods: the audience. Executions were often public. Crowds gathered in town squares and other public spaces to witness punishment. The authorities wanted people to see what happened when someone challenged the law. The suffering of one person became a warning for thousands. In that sense, the breaking wheel was more than an execution device. It was a form of psychological warfare. The message was unmistakable. The law has power over your body, and the sight of the punishment was supposed to make that power impossible to forget. Different regions and periods use the wheel in different ways, and historical descriptions vary considerably. Some accounts describe the condemned being tied to the wheel before the punishment. Others describe the body being displayed afterward. And like many practices from this period, later retellings sometimes made the process even more sensational. But the historical record is clear about one thing: the breaking wheel was not simply a legend. It was a real form of capital punishment used in parts of Europe for centuries. Eventually, however, attitudes toward public torture and execution began to change. Ideas about law, human rights, and punishment evolved. If you found this journey through history fascinating, subscribe to the channel for more dark historical stories, forgotten events, and mysteries from the past. And tell us in the comments, which dark chapter of history should we uncover next? Until then, remember, history doesn't always hide the truth. Sometimes it hides the horror.